Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
It's so wonderful to see you here. I know it's late afternoon. It looks almost like it's becoming evening, but welcome to James Chapel. As is a tradition at Union, I am going to start by acknowledging the land that we are on. Union Theological Seminary acknowledges and honors the land on which these buildings stand as the homeland and territory of the Lenape people, as well as the habitat and dwelling place of the many beings they have been in relationship with. We give thanks to all the spirits of nature. We pay respect to the Lenape people, past, present, and future, and express support for the flourishing of indigenous peoples and lifeways within this place and everywhere. So welcome to Union Theological Seminary. It's wonderful to see you all here. At Union, we like to think in our classes and in our dorms and in our hallways that we celebrate the tremendous contributions and impact of our Black faculty, our students, staff, alumni, and board all year long. And in that tradition, we are honored to host this month, Black History Month, today, right here now, an event on Womanist Interpretation. And we are holding the theme of Womanist Interpretation to celebrate the incredible life and legacy of Union's beloved alumna, Reverend Dr. Gay Byron. Oh. As you know, many of you, Gay was a distinguished professor of New Testament and early Christianity at Howard University School of Divinity in Washington, D.C. And she left an indelible mark on the fields of biblical scholarship, liberation theology, and womanist interpretations. She was a proud alum who received her MDiv, her MPhil, and her PhD from Union. And although she is no longer with us, still hard to take in, although she is no longer with us, her incredible legacy lives on through the many lives that she impacted here at Union and beyond through her ministry, her teaching, and her leadership. In honor of her profound legacy as an author, a teacher, and a revolutionary trailblazer of womanist theology, today we will be hearing from esteemed scholars in the field of womanist interpretation. The Reverend Dr. Vanessa Lovelace, the Reverend Dr. Eboni Marshall Turman, the Reverend Dr. Andrea White, and Aurora Linnell Celestin. So I'm very happy to have all of you with us today. But before we get to that, I want to just take a moment to thank the incredible planning committee that worked to ensure the success of today's event. It was led by our wonderful Director of Alumni Relations, Joe Lumen. Joe, where are you? Are you in here? I don't see Joe. She's probably out running around doing the things that it takes to run an event. So, and Aurora, who I just introduced, played a major role. And then also our beloved faculty member, Reverend Dr. Andrea White. What a team! So, thank you for joining me this afternoon. For our speakers, for all of us, that we have a good time at the reception afterwards. While I have a chance, I just want to remind you while you're here that on April 3rd at 5:30, we will host our 4th annual James Cone Lecture in this chapel. And this year's keynote speaker will be Dr. Terrence Johnson, the Charles D. Adams Professor of African American Religious Studies at Harvard Divinity School. And his lecture is titled Between Black Liberation and Democratic Womanism, Black Faith and the Spirit of Freedom in a Time of War and Moral Decadence. Promises to be an engaging, thought-provoking evening. And so now I'm going to get us started by handing it over to the wonderful Jasmine Thomas and our own Grace Hahn to lead us in our musical interlude. Thank you, Jasmine and Grace.
Give me Jesus. Give me Jesus. Help me all this world. Give me Jesus. Dark midnight was my cry. Dark midnight was my cry. Dark midnight was my cry. Give me Jesus. Give me Jesus. Give me Jesus. Help me for this world. Give me Jesus. Dark midnight was my cry. Oh, winter comes to die. Oh, winter comes to die. Give me Jesus. Give me Jesus. Give me He's got the whole world in his hands. 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 He's got all the power in his hands. He's got all the power in his hands. He's got all the power in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got you and me, brother, in his hands. He's got you and me, sister, in his hands. He's got the
Grace and Jasmine, oh my, thank you. What a tribute right there to Gay. So I want to say hello to Gay Byron's family who are streaming into this service today. And I want to begin by reading a resolution that we will be sharing with them that Union has written in her honor. Gay was on campus in the fall for an event in which we celebrated the legacy of Dolores Williams. And over the years, Gay and I have become friends, had long discussions about leadership and theological education, biblical studies. And she stopped by my office after that event, and we talked for 2 hours, so full of life, so full of possibilities, her upcoming trip to Ethiopia. It's just hard to believe that she is no longer with us, and it is heartbreaking. So today we share these words. The Reverend Dr. Gay Lynn Byron, MDiv 92, PhD 99. Unitas Distinguished Alumni 2015. Visionary Trailblazer. The Reverend Dr. Gay L. Byron was among the first African Americans to be awarded a PhD in New Testament at Union Theological Seminary, along with Cottrell Ricardo Carson and Ann Holmes Redding, all of whom graduated together in May of 1999. Inspiring and inspired historian. She illuminated heretofore unlit corners of gender, race, and ethnic identity in the New Testament, nascent Christianity, and in particular, ancient Ethiopic manuscripts, articulating and indeed floodlighting the commonalities and the enlightening aspiring scholars and established colleagues alike with her groundbreaking work. Consummate educator and academic leader. Dr. Byron served with force and flair as professor of New Testament and early Christianity and associate dean for academic affairs. That is a hard job. I hear the deans laughing in the audience. Associate dean for academic affairs at Howard University School of Divinity, where she was the recipient of several fellowships for her research, among them a grant sponsored by the Lilly Endowment, dealing with economic challenges facing future ministers, another funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, entitled Hidden in Plain Sight, Ethiopic Manuscripts and Early Christianity, sadly left incomplete at her death. In addition, Dr. Byron traveled throughout the country and internationally as a keynote speaker, lecturer, and workshop leader, contributing her spectacular organizational gifts, her formidable scholarship, and her phenomenal insight at all levels. Mentor extraordinaire. She was a lasting influence in addition to all of these other things. As a pastor, a teaching elder, a guide, a warm-hearted friend and confidant to the women following her into ministry and into the academy, not only imparting the tools of exegesis, which she always did with breathtaking inventiveness and intuition, but she counseled each and every one of those who came to mentor her so that they would develop their own hermeneutic, their own sense of voice in the world, their own place. Prolific author and esteemed editor. Dr. Byron published Symbolic Blackness and Ethnic Difference in Early Christian Literature, among many other works. She co-edited Womanist Interpretations of the Bible Expanding the Discourse. She served on the editorial board of the Journal of Biblical Literature, and she contributed her stunning intellectual prowess to a new book series on womanist interpretation of Scripture. For all this, and for so much more, we hereby laud, salute, celebrate, and cherish the memory of the Reverend Dr. Gay Lynn Byron, and we mourn her tragically untimely loss. May God grant her eternal rest in peace and power. Amen. And now I'm going to hand it over to our wonderful student, Destiny Bates, who is going to share a tribute by our amazing alumni, Ekma Ene. Destiny?
So, one of the best things about being a Black woman at Union Theological Seminary is being enveloped by the legacy of Black women who came before us. In some places, especially places like Union, legacies can serve as ghosts, haunting, taking up space, misplacing, disrupting. But in the case of Black women here at Union, we all get to be blessed by Black women and the time they spend here in this place. Gay Byron's legacy and time at Union is no exception. I got to liaise with her in the planning of the 2019 Trailblazers worship series, celebrating the gifts and work of Black alumni, specifically the fruits and legacy of Dr. Cone and the theology's birth out of Black liberation theology. Her thoughtful insight and willingness to understand what exactly we were trying to do as student leaders in this space and staying as true as possible to what we were asking of her was a gift. Finally, I will say I personally love hanging out with Black Presbyterians. The work of weaving our Blackness into this reformed, always reforming, sometimes not reforming enough church continues to be a challenge as well as a blessing. Reverend Dr. Gay Byron was a reminder to take care of each other, whatever spaces we are in, and that our uplift as Black people is necessary as spiritual labor. May we continue her hard work of caring for each other in all of our Blackness, from the classroom to the church. In life and in death, we belong to God, and therefore one another. Thanks be to God.
School of Divinity. My name is Katrina. Good afternoon and greetings from Howard University School of Divinity. My name is Katrina Murphy and I'm a second-year MDiv candidate. It was my honor and pleasure to serve as Dr. Byron's research assistant while she was working on a monograph funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. Her scholarship was not only transforming theological landscapes, but also impacting the lives of her students in and outside of the classroom in profound ways. As I pondered over what to share regarding our beloved professor and the time allotted to me, I thought about all the conversations, emails, and especially the text message that she sent to me the night before I left for Uganda. And the common thread woven and displayed throughout all of them were her gifts of compassion, empathy, and kindness. She had an open-door policy and welcomed students to stop by, where she graciously shared her knowledge and wisdom. Through her scholarship, research, and lectures, she affirmed that Black lives matter, that Black scholars matter, that Black women and their lived experiences matter, and for this, we will forever be indebted to her. While we mourn her loss, we celebrate her transition and her enduring legacy. I thought it would be fitting to close with one of her favorite quotes by Bell Hooks. We bear witness, not just with our intellectual work, but with ourselves, our lives. Thank you for allowing me to join you in this tribute to my professor and mentor, Dr. Byron.
I am tremendously honored to welcome you to the annual Womanist Trailblazers event, an event that honors the legacy of womanist theology born right here at Union Theological Seminary. I always have to give thanks for my teachers in, not in body but in mind and spirit, Dolores Williams and Katie Cannon and Jacqueline Grant and Emily Towns and Joanne Marie Terrell, and the list goes on and on. And I would say that if you are still enough, you will breathe in the color purple that is in the air. This year, we mourn the loss of the Reverend Dr. Gay Byron, a groundbreaking New Testament scholar and womanist hermeneut who received 3 degrees from Union. And our roundtable of senior womanist scholars and an emerging womanist scholar will celebrate her work. If you will permit me a little self-indulgence, I am beaming with pride when I introduce to you the phenomenal Aurora Linnell Celeste. I am privileged to, and it really is my privilege to serve as her advisor. And for those of you who serve on PhD admissions committees, you and I are in a fierce competition.
Okay.
Aurora is a second-year Master of Divinity student here at Union and serves as co-chair of the Black Women's Caucus. And if I named all the many ways that she contributes to life here at Union, we would be here all night long. She is already a womanist scholar in her own right. She's also a poet, a novelist, and a playwright, and serves as the writing professor for the Harlem Clemente course in the humanities, a Bard College program designed to increase access to higher education by offering free humanities classes to adults from 17 to 70 years old and beyond. Aurora seeks ordination and pursuing deacon's orders in the United Methodist Church. She has a BA in religion and creative writing from our neighbor across the street, Columbia University, maybe you've heard of it, and an MFA in creative writing from the New School, where she was an Impact Entrepreneurship Fellow and Right On New York City Fellow. She also, this is among my favorites about her, she's also a native New Yorker with proud Haitian and Barbadian roots. So thank you, Aurora, for joining us. We are also honored to have the Reverend Dr. Vanessa Lovelace, who is an accomplished Hebrew Bible Old Testament scholar. She specializes in Deuteronomistic history, Hebrew Bible prophets, and gender studies in ancient Israel. Dr. Lovelace teaches courses on biblical exegesis, Hebrew language, and interdisciplinary studies on Bible, race, gender, sexuality, and pastoral care. I often wonder what she doesn't do. She co-edited a volume with Dr. Gay Byron, Womanist Interpretations of the Bible, and it brings a womanist analysis to biblical texts and reveals the interconnected dynamics of race, gender, sexuality, and class in both ancient texts and contemporary Black women's lives. She's also an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ, and I'm so thrilled that you're here. Thank you. and the Reverend Dr. Eboni Marshall Turman. I'm also very proud to call her friend. She's a professor of theology at African American religion at my alma mater, Yale Divinity School. They better treat you well there. I hope they do. She also held an esteemed faculty position as assistant research professor of theological ethics, Black church studies, and African American studies, and director of the Office of Black Church Studies at Duke University Divinity School. She's an author, an ordained minister, a professor, and public theologian. And public theologian gets a whole new meaning when you think about the work and the way she shows up in the public square. Dr. Turman is a refreshing addition to our most pressing national discussions of faith, race, and gender. And with a decidedly womanist point of view, hers stands out as one of very few scholarly millennial voices offering moral perspective on issues facing the Black community. I will add that she, like Dr. Byron, also has 3 degrees from Union, including her PhD. So welcome to you. My personal thanks to the 3 of you for being with us on this special occasion. I'm going to open us up now, our roundtable discussion, and join you here as we converse. But I want to start off, I want to ask us to just give a brief word on what we mean by womanist theology. This has different meanings in different contexts, and it shows up in our scholarship in different ways. So I'd love to at least start there, and then we'll jump into the impact of Dr. Byron's work.
Is there a particular order?
I'll start with Dr. Turman, and we'll go down the line.
Great. Let me first say that it is a tremendous honor to be here tonight and to have been invited to reflect on the legacy of Dr. Gay Byron. As an alum of Union 3 times over, this is my home. Serene, you're stuck with me. And, you know, as a student here, I always held the Black women who came before me in the doctoral program in the highest esteem, and all of them are legends. All of them are legends, which says a lot about this institution. And so it is such a deep, such a profound privilege for me to be here with you for this discussion, thinking alongside Dr. Byron's work as a theologian and a theological ethicist. So in brief, I think I'll say that womanist theology is, it is a theological standpoint. It is God talk that centers, that begins with and centers the experiences of Black women, certainly in the US, but also on the continent and throughout the diaspora. In doing so, we are thinking about God from the interstices and or intersection of race, gender, and class as a baseline. But in more recent years, we have added pentagonal indices to those social indicators, so that when we're thinking of Black women's experiences, we are also thinking about sexuality, ability, generationality, pigmentocracy, or colorism alongside race, gender, and class. And so this is the starting point of our thinking about who God is in womanist theology, what God is doing in the world, and also toward an ethical bent, what we ought to be doing in the world in light of who God is. I'll stop there and thanks. Let you jump in.
To add to that, it's always important for me to say that womanist thought did not begin or did not grow out of feminist thought. It is not the sister or second or an appendage to feminist thought and rhetoric, that Black women were, whether they were activists, whether they were preachers, however they moved in the world, had to negotiate, had to navigate what it meant to be Black and a woman at the same time. When they were doing the antebellum, abolitionist work or the women's rights work, that tended to focus on the rights for white women, and when it came to abolitionism, the freeing of black men. But black women were in that space doing that work. And so that experience of naming those experiences, those simultaneously interacting experiences of black women, was then, when you get around to the Combahee River Collective, of doing that same work in the 20th century, moving from the 19th century to the 20th century, that it's only as we got into the academy and Kimberly Crenshaw in the legal work to try and put names and terms to that. And so you get intersectionality, as Kimberly Crenshaw was trying to help the legal world, especially judges, understand that you can simultaneously be impacted by race and gender and not taking two bites of the same apple. And so to understand that black women have always had this womanist way of moving and being, and it's just naming it. Alice Walker making popular the word womanist, but again, that phenomenon was always happening. And so understanding one coming from the experiences of black women, and I would say just as Alice Walker did, women of color. Dalit women in India also have appropriated the term womanist to explain their experience because they did not identify with feminists. That tends to be more elite in their perspective, and women in the global south. So as we, and I'll end, so the experiences of black and other women of color, privileging that and centering that, and then as a Bible scholar looking at biblical texts from that, but not only my own experience, but through the gender and ethnic and sexuality and those other, as she said, interstices of these simultaneously intersecting ways of looking at how does power, how does hope, how does one find meaning in life through reading these biblical texts, is how I would describe a womanist biblical approach, hermeneutical approach to reading biblical texts.
Thanks. Okay, Laura.
Well, I think every time I take a class with Dr. White, the answer has changed a bit for me. So I think this latest iteration is that for me, when I think of womanist theology, I think of that starting point in wilderness experience. I think of the fact that God knows something, a little something about what it means to be a black woman, but that on the flip side, black women know a lot about who God is. And womanist theology is the reminder that there is wisdom in those experiences, there is wisdom in that God talk, and you cannot know God in any substantive way if you are squeezing out black women, which feminist theology has done, which black liberation theory has done as well. And womanist theology becomes the response to that black women have always had a relationship with communication, with struggle. You know, back to Alice Walker's love struggle with the divine. And to know something about the divine, you have to go to those experiences, the depths of those experiences, those wildernesses that for, Dolores Williams working on Hagar, wilderness in the literal sense of the woods of the desert, but also the wildernesses for all of us wherever we may find ourselves, whether that's in the academy, in the church, in the metropolis, and what we have to offer about who we know God to be in our lives through those experiences. So that's what comes to mind for me is wilderness, but not just the kind of like hopelessness of wilderness, but the wisdom that comes out of it too.
Thank you. Thanks. Dr. Lovelace, I'm going to turn to you for the next question. What are some of the significant contributions of Gay Byron's work? I actually have here her published dissertation entitled Symbolic blackness and ethnic difference in early Christian literature. And if you don't even open the book, just simply reading the title, it already sounds like a provocation. To imagine blackness in early Christian literature and in biblical texts sounds like a pretty radical, bold move. So I'd love to hear your, help us think through the lens of your expertise in biblical scholarship, the contribution of her work.
There are several images that come to mind when I think of the significance of Gay's work, but the first one, especially in reference to symbolic blackness, is pushing the boundaries. Because what she really was doing was pushing the New Testament scholarship that treated those Ethiopic experiences, those writings, those manuscripts, as either irrelevant, invisible, insignificant to the Western Christian enterprise. And so to really try and get the New Testament, the guild, the scholarship, to understand or to look at the rhetorical significance of Ethiopians, of Egyptians and blacks, in looking at race and gender in these early Christian writings was not what anyone else was doing at that time.
That's right, that's right.
And so to say, I'm going to push this boundary and to push you all to think and take seriously the significance of this region, of this Christian tradition, of these manuscripts, and to try and still trying to get the traditional criticism that's still a focus in biblical studies, to look at these texts and take them seriously and to include them. Because that's one of the other things, and I think not only pushing the boundaries in her research, but trying to push the boundaries in the classroom in teaching about these texts. That is really significant, especially as you talked about her National Humanities grant, that she really was expanding and looking at these going to the different archives in the US that she had found that housed these manuscripts. And so she was really expanding the work of what's available to scholars that had not been looked at or paid attention to. And some of those were in Black collections, which she wrote about, especially the Howard Tweed collection that was at Howard University, even before she got there when she was still at Colgate-Rochester. And so really, again, expanding and pushing the boundaries was, I think, is most significant for her work.
Thanks. Aurora, do you want to jump in on this as well?
Sure. I think it's very timely because we've looked at a tiny bit of Gay Byron's work in Dr. Nyang's Bible and Blackness class, and it is that reminder of that the construct of blackness means something to us today, and it has that variety. It doesn't mean the same thing to everyone, but that question of where are the roots? You know, how do you trace it back? Even if it feels anachronistic to use that term when we were looking at figures in the Bible, there was still something there. There was still something proto-racialized there, and in Gay Byron's work, she's looking at it both in the proto-racialized context, but also the gendered implications of the coloring of, well, you know, Ethiopian may mean something as a shorthand in how we use it, but what did it mean to them at that time? What did it mean? Who were they to each other? And so I think that is one of the most critical, you know, no biblical scholar, but even in theological work, that is a critical thing to remember. It's the symbolism, how we use it today as weapon, as liberation tool, yes, fine, but who were these people to each other? And how were those ancient readers and listeners understanding them and the coded language? And if we go back to the significance of Ethiopia in the Bible, really diving into, like, she was really making inroads into trying to figure out, okay, what is the wholeness of this people in these racialized contexts in their own day and age, and how does that seep into the text that we consider sacred today?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Dr. Turman.
So picking up on Dr. Lovelace's emphasis on gays pushing boundaries, I think that one primary significance of her work is particularly in her asserting or contending for blackness as a founding term of Christianity. And I think that that is important for us to understand because of the ways that blackness has been written out of Christian origins. To suggest that blackness and kind of the interchangeability of that term that is found in the scholarship, the ancient Christian scholarship itself or writings, and in the ways that Dr. Byron engages the term in symbolic blackness particularly, and in her other writings, when you think about right, so we can talk about Ethiopic, we can talk about Egypt, we can talk about blackness, but when you think about blackness as a founding term for the Christian story, it disrupts everything. And I'm speaking as a scholar of the Black church and as a scholar of liberal theology in the US and the problematics that liberalism and evangelicalism have produced in the global South contemporarily. When you start with blackness as a founding term, it disrupts everything we know about the Christ story. And I could go on for days about this, but and it actually provides the groundwork. What we find in Byron is her providing the groundwork for what Cone would do 50 years before her. She's providing the backstory. She's saying blackness actually matters. We can talk about proto-racialization and all that because we know racialization didn't exist as such until the dawn of modernity. But what she's saying is race mattered in the beginning. So let me put a pin in that. Another significant aspect of her work is this, let me go back to that. And it's precisely what the church, specifically white evangelicalism, which has a grasp, right, on the church globally, right, wants us not to think. That race doesn't matter to the Christian story.
That's right.
That it has nothing to do with Jesus. I was reading some of Gay's work a few weeks ago, and I may be wrong about this because I'm not a biblical scholar, but she was writing something about Magdala, and I was like, wait a minute, Mary Magdalene was black? Just in the ways that, and I don't know if she was or what, but just in the ways that we imagine the biblical story, we imagine them in anti-black rhetorics. And what Gay does, and we don't attend to her enough, we don't attend to her brilliance enough, is she says, nah, essentially, right? She says, blackness is a fundament of the Christian story. Now, Malcolm X said, now I'm going on a tangent, but Malcolm X said, Christianity is the white man's religion. And maybe it is, but it hasn't always been.
Right.
And that's what Gay Byron's work does, in addition to helping us think the Bible alongside Africa. Again, Africa consistently and historically being written out or written in opposition to the Christian story. And she helps us think through ethno-political rhetorics, which is critical for the contemporary moment, right? And this idea that kind of the bastardization of blackness is not a modern phenomenon, but it has been happening for a very long time. In the ancient world, blackness was bastardized, right? They want us to think that this just began, right, within the context of the Great Disaster, the context of the Ma'afa, the transatlantic slave trade.
But no, this is a long story, and this story of the bastardization of blackness is interwoven irrevocably with the Christian narrative, which is why we have to interrogate our faith. I could say more, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you.
I would add one more thing in terms of the significance, and I will give credit to Margaret Amer, who was mentored and studied with and under Gay Byron, that her work was balanced in regards to, you had on the one side Frank Snowden and all things were positive about blacks and Ethiopians and Egyptians. On the other side, those scholars who would again say that blacks were viewed negatively. And Gay wanted to know the truth, and her research finds that middle ground, that is that balance of it was both and not to miss that about her scholarship.
So, Dr. Lovelace, how does her work influence your work? How does it impact what you do?
Because we were, New Testament, Hebrew Bible, our disciplines were different, but I have to say that personally, in several ways, and the first is, of course, Womanist Interpretations of the Bible, Expanding the Discourse. As a early pre-tenure scholar, actually having the nerves to approach a more senior scholar and to, even though we had Bridget Green as our intermediary, to say, would you be willing to do this volume that we finally reached this critical mass of black women who've earned their terminal degree in New Testament, Old Testament, early Christian writings, that there are enough of us to put together a volume of original essays from their womanist perspective of their context and their way of looking at these biblical texts and other texts, other sacred texts. And to be willing to do that with a junior scholar says a lot about Gay. And not only that, but as she will say, because that was when she was on the Samea editorial board, but at the same time, she had taken on Lynn St. Clair Darden, God bless her soul, who I also worked with at ITC and was like my twin, and so to lose her as well. I'm still trying to deal with losing Lynn and now losing Gay, both New Testament scholars from here. That to say, I'm going to put this womanist, this black women scholars' work out into the world. And to be in the position, I'm in this position, and I'm going to use my power, use my influence to put these scholars out there. So that was the first one. And then you mentioned her series, being the series editor of the Womanist Readings of Scripture. The second volume, Phoebe Dickerson was the first one, but the one that will be coming out in June is mine. And the Womanist Readings of the Hebrew Bible narratives as the politics of belonging from an outsider within. She shepherded that, and she saw that to the point of being put in production now for publication. Again, to say, I'm going to see this through, and I'm going to see that this book comes out. Her commitments. And then most recently, my sabbatical project was co-hosting with her a podcast to accompany Womanist Interpretations of the Bible, because we found that it was such an academic book with the jargon and the language that it wasn't as easy for the ordinary reader to grasp. We said we need to make this accessible to ordinary black women and other readers. And so our project was to interview each of the contributors about their essay and to, but make it conversational, to make it plain. And so those are the ways that Gay's work contributed to mine.
Yeah, thanks. Dr. Turman, how about you? You, as you said, you're not a biblical studies scholar, and yet I have a feeling it touches what you do in theology and ethics.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So if you knew Gay, you knew she was a small woman. She was a giant of a woman, but she was short in stature. And
she was just so she was so wonderful. Her eyes were so warm. She was so full of life. And she was so full of love. And I think pedagogically, her impact on my work has to do with trying to embody the kindness, the joy, the love, and the wonder that she always just, that was always overflowing from her whenever we would see each other, you know. So in my teaching, I hope to be full of wonder and also kind and loving and always ready to encourage my students, because that's who Gay was, to your point, Doctor. I think methodologically, she engaged in what she called emancipatory recovery. So this idea of kind of uncovering, recovering sources that were Ethiopic sources and ancient African sources that were outside of the canon, the normative canon, in order to kind of tell this other story about Christian origins, specifically in Northeast Africa. And I, in my work as a constructive theologian, as a theological ethicist, and I think womanists generally are always trying to uncover, to unveil beyond the canon, because the canon, right, has epistemically erased so much of what matters to the faith trajectories of Black women specifically, and minoritized communities broadly speaking. And so this uncovering is methodological, that happens in Gay Byron's work in her essay on Keepers of the Tradition, in your volume. Right. She kind of goes through the archives of like kind of random people and, you know, finds these treasures that tell a story about Blackness and Christian faith. And that discovery is critical for me. And then, and thinking outside of the canon is critical. And that's what I try to do in my work on dance, Black bodies and the theological. And then finally, her emphasis on, she writes about in her book, she writes about violence against the Ethiopian woman. And so she's attending, and I would say probably one of the first in biblical studies. I could be wrong about this, but one of the first, certainly if she was one of the first Black women to receive a PhD from Union, and they all received it at the same time. I mean, you know, right? So one of the first to be thinking about the diminishment of Black women and how, and the violent diminishment of Black women and how that's interwoven into the Christian story. And that is the book that I am finishing right now, Black Women's Burden, Male Power, Gender Violence, and the Scandal of African American Social Christianity. It is this, this focus, this centering of Black women and the violences that they have suffered historically. And so her work on that is a lead. Just like Dolores Williams' work on it, you know, Kelly Brown Douglas, Jacqueline Grant, right? Their work is a lead for the work we do contemporarily.
Yeah, thank you. Mm-hmm. I'm gonna close our panel with one final question. It might have a couple parts to it, so dive in wherever you'd like. Aurora, I'm gonna start with you, and we'll go down the line, and then I'm gonna open it up for a question or two from the audience. And I will, because we're live streaming, I'm gonna invite brave souls to come to the mic, and we'll ask for brief responses so that we have some time. But here's the last question, and Aurora, I'll start with you. One of the things that I often talk about in the classroom is that, you always have to talk about womanist theology in the plural. There are different womanist theologies, and the same is true for womanist biblical interpretation. There are different ways in, there are different approaches. And so I wonder if you want to, Aurora, take a shot at describing the distinctive features of Gay Byron's way in to womanist interpretation. What is it about her hermeneutical approach that marks her womanist work as distinctive?
Yes, I think, well, I'll start with, I think it's been said a lot here, but in the work she does of uncovering, it's telling a story that we've always been there. And there is this hermeneutic that suggests not something new, nothing made up, but that there is something that has always been in existence in our experience, in the Black woman's experience, that we're not making this up. It's there, we have to go looking for it. So I think whether it's in terms of just pushing the boundaries, people may react to it as a pushing of boundaries and this kind of how dare you response to the suggestions that her work brings to light. But the lens and the framework is that this has always been there, and there is a story, you use the word of erasure, that if there has been a project of erasure, her hermeneutic is one of revealing. And I don't know if this is, if anything can be wholly unique in a womanist hermeneutic, but I think what is so significant about Gay Byron's work is that for the rest of us, whether biblical scholars, theologians, you know, we can point to how groundbreaking her work is and say, we're not making this up. We've never been making this up, right? We've always have, whether you're theologians, Dolores Williams kind of womanists, talking about Hagar in the wilderness and survival, you can point to the work that Gay Byron did and saying there was the dual racialized, gendered struggle that today we will call misogynoir. It was already there in biblical texts. It was already there in texts as ancient as these biblical texts, as you said, that didn't make it into the canon. And that's a bit passive to say didn't make it into the canon, weren't included in the canon, weren't put in the canon. And that, I think that is the legacy that she is, and I hadn't even thought of what you had said chronologically about the things that she was unearthing, lay the kind of stepping stones that re-solidifies James Cone's work. Like her work is the groundwork that should have come before. And it just makes his work that much more solid and rooted. And so I think it's a hermeneutic of like, you know, it's never too late to go back and honor what is there waiting for us to uncover.
I love that.
And I think that is the lesson for me is like, okay, you know, often when you ask the question, it's what of this person's work on the page is going to influence your work on the page. But I think it's more than that in what she demonstrated and modeled. It's not just how we learn from her scholarship on the page, but her embodied model as well. That if you really believe Black Lives Matter, how are you doing that? How are you treating your colleagues? How are you treating your mentors, your mentees? And also, how are you treating the figures who have been erased, whose voices have been pushed out of canon, right? If their Black lives always mattered, how are you making that show up in your work today? Not as a brand new, oh, I discovered, but this person was always there, right? I didn't need to Christopher Columbus them. They have always been there, and their Black life has always mattered. how do I do the humble work of going back and honoring belatedly what was deserved before?
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks.
Yeah, very good. I think one of her last articles on the contemplative collegiality, the caring for Black biblical scholars, the souls of Black biblical scholars, really speaks to her womanist ethic of caring for the community. But it begins with caring for self. And I think one of the ways that she cared for herself was in her work on bringing, because it's the questions as a Black woman, her experiences as a Black woman that she brought, even though symbolic Blackness wasn't titled womanist and wasn't explicitly, it was still, you could see it in the questions that she was asking about race and gender. Mm-hmm. And that was caring for her soul as not only as a Black woman, but then as down the line, as she moved from student to researcher, scholar, and then really in the last couple of years, the pastoral part that she picked up. So caring for her own soul and caring for the souls of those that she taught in the classroom as she tried to bring the rhetorical significance of the Ethiopians and Egyptians and Blacks, and then to bring it into the pedagogy of the Wabash Center, the consultations that she was doing at SBL, the Society of Biblical Literature, to say that now we need to figure out how to help others to teach this. How do we incorporate this into the rest of our biblical scholarship? And all of that is soul caring, and that's what womanist is.
Yeah, thanks.
So to the question about Dr. Byron's approach to biblical interpretation, I want to pick up, I think, on Aurora's comment and thinking through Dolores Williams, because I do think that most womanists, even though we recognize the heterogeneity of the Womanist Theological Project, I think most womanists would understand themselves to be aligned with the hermeneutic, as Williams contended, of identification ascertainment, right? And this idea of identifying what is not there, what is not being said, in order to ascertain what we must say and what we must put in the mix. And I think we see that in the work of Dr. Gay Byron. But what is most fascinating to me about her method and her hermeneutical method, I think, is her emphasis, her reliance on the archive. I mean, I'm not a biblical scholar, but I have read a lot of womanist biblical interpretation. And and this goes back to just the centering of the kind of the Pan-Africanist spirit of her work. I don't want to say the centering of Africa, because it is an African American who is doing this archival work in Gay Byron, who is looking back. And so it's more of a Pan-Africanist identity to her interpretive lens that I think is so unique. And finally, I will say that there's an ethics at work in her interpretive gaze. And in one of her last essays, she talks about this work, this archival work, this work of recovery as a way into holding institutions accountable. And she actually pushes, we had her student talk to us earlier, she pushes Howard University to, through the archive, her own archival interpretive schema, she pushes Howard University to return materials back to Ethiopia, I think, back to Ethiopia, that had been just kind of lingering in somebody's house.
And that is ethical responsibility, that is moral responsibility at work. And if I may, what is even more intriguing for me is that she pushes the Black institution toward ethical responsibility, right? And what does that mean for the womanist scholar? To use their interpretive frameworks, right, as Gabe Byron did, to push us toward moral accountability. I think it is fascinating, and I think that it is a lasting, lasting legacy of our dear and departed sister.
Thank you. That's a good place to stop. Thank you to our amazing panelists. Thank you. So I do want to take a minute or two to open it up for questions from the in-person audience, and I invite you to come to the mic, and if you've got a question for our panel, anyone on the panel? Yeah, that is yours. Yeah. Okay.
It's wonderful being here. I haven't been here in over 22 years. I graduated many years ago from Union. But I'm not sure. How does one frame this work, womanist theology work, and the intersectionality of gender and ability? My work has been 31 years in working with children and families who experience challenges and would normally be called children with disabilities, and how their families are navigating that space. And oftentimes, those children are children from the African diaspora, or Black and brown children.
Of course.
And oftentimes, my work has overlapped with, connecting with their spirit, so to speak, with their soul, seeing them. So do you see her work informing that? Is there any conversation of her work around ability, disability, poverty, so to speak?
Yeah. Thanks.
So to your broader question in terms of womanist interpretation, yes, as Dr. Turman already said, that beyond the gender and race and ethnicity, class, sexuality, that ability, ageism, and all those others have been added on. And so in each of those, when you look at again, these are brown and Black children, so you're looking at race, ethnicity, and how is that simultaneously impacted when you put ability in the mix? How does that both how are they discriminated against specifically because of those two intersecting simultaneously? But also, what are some of the ways that we can help empower them, and recognizing that those two together are not oxymorons or not to their disadvantage.
And that's the world that they have to navigate on a daily basis. How they are being seen not only through their race and their gender, but through their ability or lack thereof. And that's something that the families that I work with every day had to navigate in the world.
Thank you for your question. I think that Dr. Byron does not deal explicitly with disability in her work that I have read. But I do think that what she does do with Blackness specifically, and at the intersection of race and gender, does have significant implications for thinking about social indicators beyond them, such as disability. She talked specifically about the Ethiopian woman, and how she was deemed in this particular writing, which is I can't remember off the top of my head, as dirty, as vile, as smelly, or foul smelling, as just diminished, right, as a human being. And I think in many ways, when we talk about ability and disability, we see that same kind of diminishment of humanity. And specifically when we talk about mental illness and how mental illness shows up just kind of on our streets, in our everydayness, our everyday context, right? We see that kind of diminishment of the Black body, right? As foul, as outsider, as completely dehumanized and demonized. And so I think that her constructive work, the work of kind of emancipating and redeeming Blackness, symbolic Blackness in the ancient world, has similar effect, right, when thinking of how we might support and work with our disabled kin to think about what liberation and think about what emancipation might look like for them. So we always have to be reading. We might not be reading something that is disciplinarily aligned with our project, but we ought to be reading for liberation, however it might manifest in our respective contexts.
Nice. Did you want to?
Sure. I think the essay was raised earlier, but her work, her very recent work on the contemplative and collegial care, I think there's something there, even if it doesn't speak explicitly on disability. It is the work of how do we reclaim our right to care in spaces that are doing the work of harm. So even if we're not talking explicitly about disability, we can still use those frameworks to look at, okay, if the empire's anti-Blackness is mass disabling, if the empire's patriarchy is mass disabling, right, how are we in our spaces, how are they replicating empire, and how do we reclaim our care? And I think that is, it may not have been explicitly said by Gay Byron in her essay, but it is the work that is still useful in addressing, the empire will disable you and then call you disabled and then discard you, right? And what do we owe each other in doing care work? And not being ashamed of that care work either. I think that was something that I felt in her writing, is that even if she says, if we're going to say Black Lives Matter, how are we living that? I think a part of that is not being ashamed in the work we need to do for our own care. And I think that gets into also the disability justice work, right? Don't be ashamed in the work that you need to do to care for someone's body, to care for someone's mental well-being. And it may not be able to dismantle the whole system, right? But how are we addressing needs without shame or disdain for people's needs?
Thank you. Thanks again to our panelists. I'm just so grateful. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you for the question. I have the honor of closing us off with a tribute that Dr. Lisa Bowens wants to share with us. She regretfully couldn't be with us in person today. She would have been on our panel with us if she could, but she shares a statement that she has asked me to read to all of you. So I want to close with that, and then we'll close with a blessing and stay for more conversation during the reception. So Dr. Lisa Bowens, a New Testament professor at Princeton Theological Seminary, says this: I am grateful to share in this tribute for Reverend Dr. Gay Byron, a dear colleague, friend, and mentor. Gay was an intrepid scholar and a captivating person. Her work in the field of New Testament and early Christianity is unmatched, in terms of its groundbreaking comprehensiveness and its bold assertions that New Testament scholars need to look beyond the Roman Empire for data regarding early Christian thought and practice. Gay's work lifted up the significance of others' ancient empires for the scholarly conversation, particularly the Aksumite Empire of the ancient Ethiopians, which was thriving alongside the Roman Empire. For her, it was important that others understand the need to expand the discourse beyond the typical scholarly lines. For example, in one of her many scholarly contributions, she asked the following questions. What would it look like if we privileged the living human documents that represent the legacy and traditions of Ethiopians, including Ethiopian women who are mentioned in monastic writings and who are living in monastic communities today? Could these living sources, past and present, expand our canon beyond the 66 books of the Protestant Bible? She goes on to say, this emphasis on the women themselves as living sources resonates most with my goal of moving beyond canonical sources for interpreting the sacred text and cultures that are reflected in the New Testament. These quotes highlight just some of the significant features of Gay's seminal contributions to the field of New Testament and early Christian history. As illustrated by her interests, Gay was a prominent womanist scholar who advocated the expansion and the elevation of Black female voices, past and present, to the current biblical interpretation enterprise. Indeed, she expanded the circle by elevating those voices that had been left out, those voices that had been silenced, those voices that had been forgotten. She was determined that her scholarship would focus upon those from whom we could learn so much and those whose paths have made possible our own. Of course, Gay's emphasis on expanding the biblical canon in terms of the Africana experience was not entirely new, as she herself noted and understood. In her research, she often credited the work of scholars upon which she built her own analyses. She followed in the bold and beautiful footsteps of many who have gone before her, such as Kane Hope Felder and Katie Cannon. Yet even though Gay followed in such footsteps, she forged her own unique path of brilliance. She committed herself to what she called a womanist biblical ethic of reinterpretation that includes living sources, creative collaboration, critical inquiry, and a quest for survival and wholeness of entire people throughout the globe. She urged womanist biblical critics to, quote, claim the ethical priorities and presuppositions that undergird their scholarly endeavors and offer reinterpretations of sacred text that transgress canonical boundaries and dismantle structured academia amnesia. Her scholarship exemplifies all these important aspects of womanist biblical thought, including the transgressing of canonical boundaries and the dismantling of structured academic amnesia. Her emphasis on transgressing canonical boundaries coheres with the long tradition of Black folk refusing to stay in their place and refusing to let the boundaries white set for them define their own existence. Gay urged womanist biblical scholars to think outside of the proverbial box and not to be confined to the Guild's understanding of what counts as sources for scholarly analysis and inclusion. Our voices matter. Our experiences matter. Our writings matter. Our traditions matter, including our oral traditions. Along with being an impeccable scholar, Gay was also a friend and advisor. She was an advisor to many, like me, who were just beginning in the field. I had a chance to spend a good amount of time with her as she was one of the leaders on the leadership team at the Wabash Workshop for early career theological faculty. Her presence made the experience an even richer and important learning opportunity for myself and the other early career attendees. She was always willing to provide advice, wisdom, and a little humor for our theological and academic journeys. In addition, she was not only willing to provide me with advice regarding professional development, but also advice for personal issues as well. For I found in her a listener, a confidant, and an encouraging cheerleader. Gay has modeled for me what it means to do the work of and for our people. Dr. Sharon Fluker, an excellent scholar in her own right and former director of the Fund for Theological Education, so often reminded us doctoral fellows at FTE conferences to do our scholarship for our communities. Sharon would often say, "Do it for the people." Indeed, Gay's work embodied Sharon's exhortation. Gay did just that. Her scholarship was for the people and about the people, the Black voices often left out of the biblical studies conversation. I am so grateful for Gay's life and legacy. She impacted my life in ways that I have yet to fully understand, and in ways that will continue to unfold in years to come. She leaves a powerful legacy for all of us, her colleagues, her students, and all who have known her. Her scholarship, her wisdom, and her tenacious spirit remains a beacon for all of us that she leaves behind. Gay has entered that great cloud of witnesses that Hebrews speaks about so powerfully. I hope that my work and the work that all of us engage may continue to honor her life and legacy of brilliance and strength. Thank you, Dr. Bowens. And now I want to end with a blessing, and I'm going to invite all of my current students and my former students from Emory University to come join me for a blessing. As a blessing to all of us gathered, I will give the Reverend Dr. Gay Byron the last word, and in fact, you can even take as a token of our event today, your program has the blessing printed on the very last page. These are the words of our dear beloved Gay. Those who know the living God of peace, justice, deliverance, and liberation are called to rise up in this moment. Keep protesting. Keep gathering in your communities of faith to worship, study, pray, and mobilize for the long haul. Keep your feet in the streets and at the doors of your elected leaders. Keep the faith. God is not to be mocked. Let us not grow weary in this fight for justice. Rest in peace, Gay Byron. Amen. Amen. Thank you. Blessings. Thank you. Future Dr. Aurora Celeste. And to Reverend Dr. Eboni Marshall Turman and Vanessa Lovelace. Thank you so much. And to Jasmine, our singer. And Serene, thank you. And Joe, for all the planning, thank you. And now please join us for a reception where we can mingle and converse some more.